always seems like Nintendo puts out a Kirby game after the limitations of their hardware have been explored a little bit. This is probably why Kirby games always seem to be on the cutting edge of graphics, and Kirby 64 is no different. It was the year 2000, and with the Nintendo GameCube due out the next year, the full capabilities of the N64 have been well and truly explored, which meant it was time for HAL Labs' Pink Menace to kick off the console's last year of relevance. Sadly, while Kirby 64 was a decent enough game, I would say this is one of the less noteworthy games to come out of both the franchise and the N64's library as a whole. In Kirby 64, a dark force attacks a planet of fairies and attempts to take their power crystal. One of the fairies manages to flee with the crystal, but it is shattered during the escape. The fairy lands on Popstar and encounters Kirby, who is of course down to help the fairy gather the crystal shards and save her home planet. It's a pretty basic story as far as the Kirby series is concerned, but I was surprised at the level of character here. There are actually cutscenes and character interactions here, and they do a good job getting the personalities across. It's simple, but it's also cute and charming, which is why it's bet from this series. It also helps that the presentation is excellent. HAL Labs did a great job translating the characters into 3D, and the animation on all of them is extremely effective. The levels are nice and varied with plenty of imaginative design, and it all runs well. The cutscenes actually run at 60 FPS, and the gameplay itself runs at a crisp 30. It's very well done, though I gotta be honest, the music wasn't doing it for me. There are a few that sound pretty rad, but most of the time I found it to be pretty forgettable. The sound effects are pretty good though, especially when you land the final blow on one of the bosses. So crunchy. I am curious though if people were disappointed with Kirby 64 when it came out. The 32-bit era was defined by 3D gaming, so most franchises were making the jump at the time. You'd think HAL would have done the same for Kirby 64, but while the graphics in the game are 3D, the game still functions as a side-scroller. Yep, Kirby 64 is a 2.5D platformer, which I think was kinda clever. It allowed the game to remain 2D, while escaping the stigma that 2D games had at the time. And Kirby does take advantage of the fact that the gameplay takes place in a 3D space, as not only will you be interacting with stuff on the 2D path, but also stuff in the background. I wonder if Retro Studios studied this game when they eventually did Donkey Kong Country Returns. It's kinda neat, but I gotta be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the dynamic camera they use. Rather than keeping the camera at one consistent angle, it instead changes every now and then. Though it can give you a better view of the 3D space, it can also make it a little difficult to see what you are doing. As for the controls, it's a mixed bag. Movement is a little on the slow side for me, and while the play control on the jump is fine, the jump itself is slightly unresponsive. I noticed several times when I went to jump, yet for whatever reason Kirby didn't. Thankfully, the level design doesn't demand too much from you, and you still have the ability to puff Kirby up and fly for a bit. Kirby also has the typical inhale and copy abilities. You can still suck up enemies and spit them out as projectiles, or you can swallow them and copy their powers. Something that might disappoint some people is that there are only 12 abilities total, but the game makes up for that with the combine function. You have the option to expel your powers and then throw them at an enemy, which will then combine the two powers together. If you combine two of the same together, you'll get a powered up version of the ability, but if you combine them with something else, you'll get a variety of different abilities. This is the main appeal of Kirby 64. Experimenting with the combine feature to see what you get, and sometimes it's useful, and sometimes it's just plain silly. It's a cool concept, but the method of combining powers is a little clunky. Having to eject your power and then hit an enemy with it is harder than you think, and it can lead you to lose your powers at an inopportune time. Not that that ever becomes a real problem though, because as you'd expect, Kirby 64 is pretty easy. The platforming is never too difficult, the enemies aren't that threatening, and the bosses don't pose much of a challenge either. In fact, some of them can go down shockingly fast if you have the right power. And I'm always torn when I get to this point when I'm talking about a Kirby game, because I don't know exactly how to critique it. The low difficulty can make the game a little dull to play, but at the same time, I acknowledge that that's the point. Kirby games are supposed to be beginners platformers after all, so complaining about the lack of difficulty would be like complaining about a Dark Souls game being too hard. I typically chalk it up to taste, and people who are familiar with my taste know I'm not the biggest fan of the Kirby series as a result of its low difficulty. I don't hate it or dislike it, I'd just rather play something a bit more challenging when it comes to platformers. Kirby 64 is also on the short side. You can finish this game in less than 5 hours, which I'm actually thankful for because I'm almost out of time to finish these videos. A game I can knock out in one sitting is very nice. Kirby 64 was well received by critics at the time, and it was commercially successful. Though it would only be the 28th best-selling game on the console, for a game that came out this late in its life cycle, that's solid performance. Despite its success, however, Kirby 64 would be the last mainline Kirby game to be released on the console until 2011's return to Dreamland. There would be plenty of spin-offs, sure, but most of Kirby's adventures from this point would be on the handheld. This is probably because HAL always seemed hesitant to do a full 3D Kirby game, and if the series wanted to justify remaining in 2D, the handhelds were the place to be, at least until 2D games became popular again. It wouldn't be until 2022, 22 years after Kirby 64, that HAL would give it the old college try. And you know what? Maybe that time was well spent, because Kirby and the Forgotten Land was pretty damn good. As for Kirby 64, in retrospect, people seem to have positive things to say about the game, but I find it seen as sort of middle of the road for the series. Not as popular as something like Kirby Superstar, but I don't think anyone will look at this as the worst game in the series. Personally, I didn't really get into Kirby 64, but as I said, I'm not a big fan of the series to begin with. If you're a fan of the franchise though, this one is for sure worth checking out.